Well, hello, everyone, and hello to the virtual everyone as well. My name is Aubrey Williams, and I am the Open Scholarship and Digital History Librarian, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am so excited to have you all here for our Queering Games, Queering Imaginaries event for Open Access Week. And I'm so excited to introduce you to our special guest speaker, Edmund Chang, and Edmund is a professor of English at Ohio University, but he actually completed his PhD here at UW, so he's a fellow alum. His areas of research include technoculture, race, gender, and sexuality, queer game studies, digital humanities, popular culture, and 20th to 21st century American literature, so a true Renaissance man. He is the creator of Tellings, a high fantasy tabletop RPG, and Archaea, okay, perfect. A live action role playing game, and he's also an editor for Analog Game Studies and a contributor editor for Gamers with Glasses. And I met Ed over the summer at DHSI, where he co-taught the course Queering DH with Jason Boyd, and it was really one of the best workshops I've ever taken. I learned a lot. I think about it often about like the theory that we talked about, and I especially enjoyed the module on queer gaming and our final project where we used AI to create a queer gaming queer game card trading game, and we printed them out. It was super fun. I think everybody really liked it at the final presentation, and I think one of the biggest takeaways I had was that the importance of community and queer identity and how it really intersects with gaming and digital humanities work. And it really subverts that capitalistic and consumer-based model for connection and discovery and pleasure. And so when we were developing this OA week, which has the theme of community over commercialization, this was the first person that I thought of. And I thought this would just be perfect and fun and interesting.
As I drink from my...
From start, yeah. Yeah, and so I'm so happy he's here to share his knowledge, and I'm so excited for this workshop. And without further ado, I give you Ed.
Hooray, thank you so much. Okay. Let me get this situated. You can still hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. So there are a number of you I would love if you wanted to move forward. That would be great. There are a couple of interactive bits because it's both a talk and kind of a workshop. And so I'm going to talk and read and talk and read and talk and read. And then I wanted to save plenty of time for Q&A, interaction, and all that good stuff. So, make notes of your questions. Happy to talk about them. Happy to have some crosstalk as well. So let's do the official stuff. Thank you to the University of Washington, the UW Libraries, the Open Scholarship Commons, and the Departments of Cinema and Media Studies and English, and the Simpson Center for the Humanities, and of course to Aubrey for the invitation to share some of my work. And thanks to all of you for your participation and attention. So, my presentation is organized roughly into 3 acts, 3 sets of provocations. First, I want to define a term I call technonormativity, the implicit and explicit norms of code, computers, games, algorithms, and generative AI. Second, I want to present 2 short games to define and demonstrate the constraints and affordances of queering mechanics in queer gaming. And we're going to do a little exercise about queering mechanics. And then finally, I want to end with a few possibilities for countering, disrupting, and reconfiguring technonormativity, particularly via open access, gaming scholarship, pedagogy, and production, and playing with technologies and expectations. So if you want to talk about teaching with games, all that sort of stuff, I'm happy to talk about that as well. So to do so, I'm going to collage and mangle some stuff together. And I'm going to be mixing a few domains: literary theory, digital humanities, queer game studies, queer AI studies, and speculative futures. So, Act 1, fabulously titled High Heels in HTML. And as Aubrey says, over the last 5 years now? I don't even remember. I teach a workshop with Dr. Jason Boyd at Digital Humanities Summer Institute, which in recent memory has been held at the University of Victoria, but in the next year we'll be moving to Montreal. So it'll be fascinating, interesting. And if you're not familiar with DHSI, it's basically summer sleepaway camp for computer nerds, data library nerds, and archive nerds. So it's fun and very intense. It's like I can't explain it. It's super strange. But we teach a course on queer digital humanities and sort of to thinking about like the ways that digital humanities sort of writ large. Like, how do humanists use technology? How does technology inform humanist work? And then, those sorts of questions. But we've been sort of including more and more stuff about queer games. And now, of course, with the rise of generative AI, like thinking about can AI be queer and, those kinds of questions. So one of the things that we did was we had ChatGPT write a definition of queer digital humanities. And this was part of a series. And I think the official prompt that generated this was to write a definition with a lot of malapropisms, right? But for some reason, it did this. So queer digital humanities is an incredibly flambe field that dabbles in the spicy intersection of queer identity and technology-driven humanities scholarship. It's like a rainbow-colored disco ball spinning in cyberspace, bringing together fabulous concepts, sassy methodologies, and techno-magical glitter. And if that were true, we would all be in it, right? So, right? And then later at the bottom, so darlings, brace yourself for a flamboyant journey through the land of queer digital humanities where high heels and HTML collide and the disco beats of social justice resound. It's an enchanting world of glitter, pixels, and provocative theories, a place where the boundaries between the analog and the digital get deliciously blurred, leaving us all a little gagging for more. I have no idea where it picked up this voice or decided that malapropisms equaled like queen, right? Like gay queen or camp queen. But we thought this was really funny, and we actually now use this as our official course description, and to think about the ways that AI is not always bad, I guess, or always pessimistic. But in reality, obviously, it does get to some of the core concepts of what DH does. So using digital tools to make visible queer representation and queer communities, and then using queer studies to think about those digital tools or technologies and things like that. So what I love about this description is that it points up what generative AI like ChatGPT does well, which is to allow for play, serendipity, transformation, and what it doesn't do well, which is accuracy, specificity, and obviously any kind of deep understanding. Moreover, it exemplifies the discursive norms and tropes of large language models in its use of stereotypical quote-unquote gay voice or drag voice or camp as signifiers for queer, right? So I think what it did was it kind of knows what digital humanities is because it can kind of predict what those things are. But the minute you add the adjective queer, it has to pull from other sort of linguistic cues. And that's why we get this, which I think is sort of interesting and fascinating to sort of think about. The above example helps me think about how these technologies evince what Donna Haraway calls the informatics of domination, or what Thomas Foster, who is a professor here at UW, calls the key antinomy of posthumanism, which I shorthand as the very technologies that can be used for liberation, democracy, social justice creation can also be leveraged for control, oppression, violence, and domination. Right. The best example, easiest example is like, think about social media, right? So we have all these stories about social media being used as ways to organize for democracy or organize protests, all that sort of stuff. But it's also the very same technology now being used to spread disinformation, to radicalize, all those sorts of things. So this is where my work in queer DH and queer game studies and speculative futures comes in, right? I want to think about the ways that code, algorithm, and design are technonormative, or the ways that games, digital narratives, and other tech are structured implicitly and explicitly normed, and that the player, reader, user, whatever, is always constrained. Make sense? Questions? Okay, so let me move to a different example. One of the ways I've been thinking about this is in my own scholarship. I'm really proud of this essay, so I talk about it a lot. This essay, Why Are the Digital Humanities So Straight?, is an essay I wrote. It appears in Alternative Historiographies of the Digital Humanities, co-edited by Dorothy Kim and Adeline Coe. And when I pitched it, I was like, I'm going to do something weird, because I was tired of writing sort of traditional scholarly, 30-page essays, all that good stuff. And at the time, it was only Adeline who was editing, but she was like, great, do it. Do weird things, right? Because this collection is about sort of pushing boundaries. And so I wrote an essay in the form of a basic program, and the code itself is the essay. And then the code is also executable. If you copy and paste it into a basic emulator, it runs like a text adventure. And so what you're seeing is an animated GIF of kind of the essay running. And I was really, really fortunate because the essay was selected to be part of the Electronic Literature Organization's ELC, or Electronic Literature Collection 4. And I think it's really cool. So basically, why did I write this essay? I wanted to think about the ways that it's really hard in an essay to sort of kind of demonstrate how normative code is, right? Because most of the time when you're using a program, whether it be Microsoft Word or playing a game or just doodling around on your phone, you don't get to see what's happening under the hood. So I wanted to write an essay that the program itself was also visible, so that you could actually see what was happening as the essay went along. Why Are the Digital Humanities So Straight? Riffs off of Tara McPherson's essay, Why Are the Digital Humanities So White?, which is an amazing and great essay. According to both essays, code in whatever form is never empty, homogeneous, and neutral. The material, embodied, virtual, and performative worlds imagined and enacted and augmented by code, particularly the languages and practices of digital computers, are always inflected and infected by race, gender, class, desire, nation, and other intended and unintended meanings, right? McPherson says, we must remember that computers themselves are encoders of culture. Computation responds to culture as much as it controls it. Code and race and other subjectivities are deeply intertwined, even as the structures of code labor to disavow those very connections, right? So an easy way to explain that is we often think of technology like generative AI as tools, right? So when you call something a tool, what you do is that it just sits there. It doesn't do anything until you use it. So computer encodes are technonormative. According to Judith Butler, heteronormativity is the matrix of power and discursive relations that effectively produce and regulate the intelligibility of sex, gender, and sexuality for us, right? How do we know what those things are? And so I extend that idea to think about the ways that technology itself is also doing these kinds of things, right? Okay, so here's a little bit of the code this is what the essay actually looks like when it's printed. And one of the reasons why I picked BASIC was A, I know how to program in BASIC, and B, that BASIC is relatively readable, right? So if you ignore all of the sort of line stuff, all the text is actually, you can sort of see what actually it is saying, right? And then what happens is you have the essay itself, but then at the very end of the essay are where all the functions are. So the program calls to certain things. And so in the game, there are 3 sections where I talk about Alan Turing, Ada Lovelace, and then Perna Jackson, who is a character from a zombie horror video game. And then you play as that character in that sort of kind of text adventure, where you have to look at things and interact with them and all that sort of stuff. And here's the code for Alan Turing. That's all it is. And here are the only actions that you can do, like stand up, look around, type, all these sorts of things. And what's important, again, obviously, is the correct commands are predetermined but give the illusion of choice, right? Unable to see the code, the player's commands are arbitrary and contained. And so I could make 1,000 lines of commands, and that would make it seem even more and more like it's understanding what you're trying to ask it to do, like ChatGPT. But in fact, it's really still limited by just the number of lines that there are. And then the other thing is, what's really important is what are things that we can't see. So there are 2 commands at the very end here, which no one would ever know unless you saw the code or somehow magically guessed them. And the 2 commands are stop being gay, right? And come out, right? And so if you type that produces a different reaction in the text adventure, right? And obviously, Alan Turing was a famous homosexual, computer scientist, engineer, all these sorts of things, right? A part of the history of computer science and AI. So the main idea here is that unless you can see the code, there are missed opportunities. First, to talk about the ways that code deeply constrains the player, and second, the missed queer opportunities like the command "stop being gay." Now, whether this code is queerer because I'm a queer person of color writing it is something else that we can sort of think on and discuss as well. Okay, queer games. For this section, I want to think about a couple of games that I think do some interesting things, right? So video games, game development, and video game cultures are historically and stereotypically not diverse or inclusive. And so here's a meme that came out, I think in 2016, it might be a little earlier than that, where you have this sort of poster of video game protagonists, and the tagline, if you can't read it, is "Kids love brown-haired 30-something white men," right? These are all different characters, by the way, from 30 different games. So there is this sort of baked-in idea that video games are for a particular group of players and people. Unfortunately, the statistics hasn't really drifted that much, even in 2024. So if you want to be really depressed, I can go find those statistics for you. Okay, so let's look at two games. The first is a game called Loved by Alexander Osius in 2010. It is a puzzle platformer featuring a non-binary avatar. I kind of think they look like a cat, but you could decide what they are. The game opens with the unseen narrator, overseer, that asks the player character, "Are you a man or a woman?" And then regardless of the answer, the narrator decides for us, gaslights the player character, and says that you are a girl. And then on the surface, the game is about power, control, and abuse in a toxic relationship. However, what makes Loved a queer game is the yoking together of narrative and mechanics. The powerlessness and lack of control the avatar character experiences mirrors the fantasies of power and control that the player assumes and expects. Does anyone want to come and play Loved for a little bit? It's not that hard. Come on up. So you can just come over, and it's
no matter what I pick, it's going to make me.
Well, you can just remember you didn't think you didn't hear that.
I don't know this.
Yeah, you don't know this. You're a totally new player. Yeah. No. There you go.
Cool. They're kind of cute.
Yeah. You're this little plump blob.
I don't trust them.
You're very good at this. I am not.
This isn't doing anything.
No.
Oh, okay.
Oh. Okay, this time touch the statue. It becomes a save point.
Yeah, that's what I realized.
Yeah. Okay, so while that's going on, so you could play the game and follow all of the directions, and it produces a certain ending, quote unquote, the good ending. You could play the game where you mix it up, or you can play the game where you ignore all of it. And as you can sort of see, you're really bad at this. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. What you can see is, do you see the little squares changing in the background? The more you refuse, the more the screen becomes distorted and pixelated and all these sorts of things. Just do it. You can do it. Okay. There's a lot of drifting.
I'm noticing.
All right. We'll get to the next one, and then yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Hooray! So what's really interesting about this, gameplay is loose and imprecise, often resulting in wild jumps, unintentional slides. One of the things that my students often say is that it's so hard to control, right? Like, this game is designed poorly, right? Because they don't get to have the sense of power and control and agency that games are supposed to offer them. And I'm like, no, it's not a design flaw. Think about it as a design feature and what that might mean for you to not be able to control yourself in these like precise jumps. So you're not a bad player. You were drawn that way, right? That's why I think, you know, this idea of the game is sort of playing with these ideas of power and control. So as the game becomes pixelated, what's really fascinating is that in a way, it becomes harder and harder to actually play because because sometimes those blocks will cover barbs or lava or whatever. But at the same time, it feels like color is returning to the world, right? Because it starts off black and white, as you can sort of see here. And then it also feels like the world is breaking down. All right, game number 2 is Merritt K's Limb, which disappeared from the internet for a long time, but in basically this past year returned. Merritt K republished it, so you can play it now. So who wants to play? Okay, so you're a little square, and you are just moving through this little maze. I call it the fallopian tubes of life. That's what it reminds me of. I don't know why, but
The path we've all traveled.
But now you're a little, you know, flashing square. All right, and then you see other squares. But then you're like, oh, I know, I'm flashing square again.
Oh, no.
Okay, press Z, and you turn into the color that they are, and you can kind of get by them. So just try to slide by them. There you go. Maybe not. There's a... Okay, there you go. Okay. Nope, Z. They're like super mean. All right, un-Z and then Z again and when you're next. Okay, there you go. All right. And you can un-Z until you see another one. Do, do, do.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Ah, it's pushing me.
Oh.
Which one am I?
Right. Uh-oh. Now you're stuck. Okay, we'll stop there. All right. So you get the idea, right? I love this game. I write about this game a lot. On the surface, it's very simple. You're just this little square trying to mind your own business. At first, the other squares don't bother you, but as you progress, especially if your avatar isn't the same color as them, they start attacking you. Students find this game very, very stressful. And you can see why, because it is stressful. And this is why I often teach this game, because the affective response is so powerful that, in a lot of video games, there is this drive towards photorealism, right? Or even hyperrealism. And I'm like, you care about this little square in a way that seems, insane. But at the same time, you're like, no, don't hurt me, right? As the player navigates the simple maze, they are, harried by bullying blocks. And at some point, and I'm going to try to recreate it, sometimes... So obviously when you press Z, you focus in and you sort of slow down. So passing is hard, right? Like, you're like, don't pay attention to me. You're just like kind of trying to sneak by. Excuse me, Regina George. We could totally make a Mean Girls skin of this game, probably. All right, let me get to a room where there's lots of them. Okay, nope, it's like... But as you go on, by the way, I've never finished this game because it's hard because these bullies are mean. There we go. Okay. Let me see if I can do it. I don't think I can. We'll see.
Oh, there's sound too.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Okay. So every once in a while, you get knocked out of the maze. And I call this the queerest moment of the game, right? It's a glitch, clearly. And I have asked Merritt K, was this purposeful? And they responded, as all good magicians, maybe. But it doesn't break the game. This is the thing about glitches, is that they often don't break the game, because I can still play. It keeps going. It doesn't crash. It doesn't say game over, and you can go and, look at what's in the other rooms. And I think this sort of glitch is this sort of queer moment. It's not a perfect moment, because, you're like, oh, I don't have to be bullied, but you're still kind of outside of the world, so to speak. And then the end of the game is very cute. You meet another square like yourself. But here, you're on opposite sides of this wall. But at least you lived, which I think is, pretty good for queer characters. Okay. This supposed accident breaks the illusion of seamless and invisible code, computation, and other machine processes. Glitches reveal the formality and fragility of the rules of the game and of the algorithm. This glitch in limb is a queer moment, a queer mechanic that challenges the normativity of code and digital technologies. So what are queer games, or what is queer gaming? This is a term that I defined in an essay called Queer Gaming that appears in Queer Game Studies. And basically, it's this idea that queer gaming is heterogeneity of play, imagining different alternatives, game narratives, mechanics, avatars, worlds. It's a provocation, a horizon of possibilities. It's a refusal of the idea that digital games are just made for these folks, right? Or, those are the only identities that are available. And then queer gaming offers much more than things like more decision trees and more choices, better graphics, immersive sound, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I think queer games, or good queer games do, is really sort of push against the genre conventions of games, the mechanical conventions of games, and obviously the narrative conventions of games. And so queer gaming isn't just about like game narratives. So you can have romance plots with queer characters, you can have queer characters themselves. But I think it's a game that's really trying to think about how to address the medium-specific, limitations and possibilities of a game. So here comes the workshop-y part, and maybe we'll just spend maybe 5 minutes, and you can I was going to originally, have you pair up. You can still do that if you want. So this is an exercise I often do with my own students and whenever I'm teaching queer gaming. In the original, you would act all of this out, and it's super fun, because I do think also thinking about mechanics as embodied and code as embodied is really, really important. So here's a really simple game, and it's Space Invaders. All of you have played some version of this game, right? Yes? Or do we know what it is? Aliens, Space Invaders, are coming down, and then you are the little laser turret at the bottom going back and forth, and you're trying to shoot them and kill them. And then these are barriers that stop your bullet, and you sort of have to dodge around them. They also shoot down at you, and so you can hide underneath the barrier. So in the next couple of minutes, what I want you to do is pick one thing about this game, just from what you see here. And you could change the sprites, you could change the mechanic of firing the bullet or laser beam or whatever it is. You could change the fact that the aliens are trying to kill you, whatever. Change one thing to make it queer, right? And it doesn't have to be queer in the sense that the aliens want to smooch you. That's fine. You could go there, right, if you want to. But how might it actually resist the sort of norm of a game like this, which is really the rehearsal of xenophobia, of war, of nationalism even, whatever. So maybe just think about it, or you can chat briefly amongst yourselves, and then maybe we'll have people just sort of share how they might change it. You get a minute, 2 minutes maybe, to think about stuff. Okay. I will share you one simple version, and hopefully, I'll have you all do it so if I accidentally steal your thunder, that would be really horrible. Who wants to go first? Suddenly this turned into class and everyone's like, no! We could also just go around the room. Yeah, go for it.
My initial thought was having the barriers actually shoot, but in both directions.
In what?
In both directions.
Okay.
I was just thinking in terms of like how the things that help you can sometimes also hurt
you. Okay, so this is like a queer pessimistic kind of change. That's fine. That's fine. We're like, we're going to be effed no matter what happens, right? And that's great. I think that's an interesting thing to be like, well, what if we made this harder or more difficult? And we can think about whether or not that's actually, actually queer or not. I don't know, because sometimes games that are really hard often get read as like, these are real games, these are real gamers play hard games, like, you know, that sort of stuff. But I like that idea. I like the idea that sometimes things that help you also might actually hurt you. That's great. How about up here?
I'll try to summarize. So we talked about having the point system be negative instead of positive.
Okay.
Use points for killing aliens.
Oh.
Instead of shooting them, you actually give them fabulous outfits every time you.
Great. Amazing.
We talked about removing the barriers themselves so that they're like you're trying to make it so they can come to you.
Okay. Great.
I think there was one more.
Yeah. That's a lot. I just asked for one. No, I'm just kidding. Overachievers. I like this idea. So my obvious change would be to remove points, right? So it's just one really simple mechanic, but the idea that why is this competition? Everything else stays the same, but then you're like, why are you shooting the aliens? What's the reason, right? I'm not getting anything out of, well, obviously except for like not being invaded, but I think once you take points out of it, because the points equates to killing the alien to being like a good thing, a positive, you know, that sort of stuff. How about back there?
We talked about every time the aliens hit the side of the screen, they move down, they speed up.
Right.
And like, what if they're not speeding up? What if maybe they're slowing down?
Okay.
I think that like dramatically changes the affective experience of shooting at them.
Yeah.
The closer they get to you, the less they want to.
So it's changing the movement of the aliens, either slowing them down or, you know, just even changing how they respond to you. What if they didn't move at all? Like, you know, what would that look like?
Or went backwards. Right?
Or went backwards. They're like, oh no, we made a mistake. You know, we came in peace, but now you're shooting at us. And then they start going away, right? That would be great. What if we turn this into a dancing game? Like, you know, you're trying to dance with the aliens and like, you know, I don't know, whatever. How about up here? You three.
We were thinking about dressing up the aliens and
okay, yes,
different colors and have those mean different things for values on like what you're allowed to hit, what you're not allowed to hit.
Sure. What if this was like, okay, the obvious one that a lot of people do is they change the shooting mechanic to something else. So I think this group up here, we're talking about like, what if it wasn't shooting missiles, it was shooting something else, right? So what if it was like shooting like Cupid's arrow and you're trying to match aliens, you know, or like, you know, send them off and to be in love or, you know, all that sort of stuff. Was there something else that y'all talked about? I don't remember.
Well, yeah, I think I was thinking about, you know, changing the laser cannon.
Oh yes, the cannon itself.
Like what if the laser cannon is also an alien?
Right.
Same color, same thing, you know, then it becomes
also pessimistic.
Yeah, pessimistic. It's like about infighting or it's about
right. Yeah. You know? Well, because again, the game, this is about defending your world. But what if it were more politically more complicated than that? Okay, we'll just leave that there for right now. So here's the thing. I think this is what's really important is, and then if we had longer time, I would say, you know, we want this one change to change everything. But I think it's really important to be like, let's change this one thing, but think about everything staying the same. And does that actually do anything, right? And then the other thing is people are like, well, how do you make a queer game? How do you make a queer game? And I'm saying it's very easy. Right? It doesn't have to be, the game itself have to be like this whole suite of things, but how might we reimagine games that we already have and to think about at the sort of like a single mechanic, changing one single thing. And this comes from, you know, theater and movies and other medium where people change one thing, like the casting of one character or the changing the gender or the sexual orientation of a character or changing one single plot. And it really does shift everything else that happens around it, right? I just saw, shout out to Novelties Theater, which is a Seattle-based theater group, burlesque sort of performance group, but they just did Hamlet. And the thing they changed, one of the things, they changed many things, but well, first of all, they're stripping it. So like, that's pretty cool. But one of the things they changed is Ophelia lives and becomes the narrator of all of the events of Hamlet, and I find that really fascinating and interesting, right? Because, spoilers, she dies in the original play, actually quite horribly, right? Which I think is lovely. Okay, questions? That was fun, right? Pretty easy, super easy to do in class too. All right, last act. Disaster AIs. I don't know if you know that phrase, disaster queers or disaster lesbians or disaster bisexuals. Like, that's what I'm playing at, this idea of like, you know, the person that's like overwrought and stuff is going on. Okay. In the face of the intensification of 21st century technonormativity across all sectors of life, speaking about pessimism, particularly with the advent of generative AI, this last section actually is about hope. Maybe. Hopefully. Rather than recursively rely on and repeat the same questions and answers in operating systems, we must imagine and develop queerer, more just, and speculative technologies in relationships with those technologies, right? So here's just a bunch of headlines I ripped of AI doing really horrible things. And this has been happening for decades, actually, but more intensified now in all sectors of the world, from McDonald's getting orders wrong to bias in healthcare systems to, I remember the first time they were like, we're going to build this Twitter bot and just let it be free on the internet. And within a day, it became the most racist, virulent, crazy. And you're like, wow, that was just predictive. And so how do we fix this, or can we even fix this, right? I love Kara Keeling's work on their essay Queer OS, and basically they argue that this is a way of thinking and acting with, about, through, among, and at times even in spite of new media technologies and other phenomena of mediation. It insists upon forging and facilitating uncommon, irrational, imaginative, and or unpredictable relationships, right? The new game then is not one of imitation. Shout out to Alan Turing's An Imitation Game, of the past, of the discipline, of the norm, but of interrogation, inclusion, and ultimately inspiration. And so I don't know what queer code actually is, but it is something that we actually have to start thinking about, right? I think it's bell hooks, but I could be wrong. But like this idea, like, you can't have a future if you can't imagine it. And so one of the things that whenever I teach Queer OS, right, this is an essay that's about like, well, what if code was like, did weird things or broke, or was, what if you designed a whole game? So the limb game, I was like, that glitch I think is really interesting. Well, what if you designed a whole game around a glitch of some sort? Well, we don't want that in computers, right? Because glitches mean something is broken or something isn't working. But it's not that I want the game to be broken. I just want this, like, the whatever, the aesthetic, the politic, the sort of ludic mechanic of like, well, the glitch is surprising, so how do we sort of recreate that sort of effect in some way? Speaking about embodiment, I think one of the things that we also have to think about when we're thinking about queering code or queering technology or queering games or whatever is to remember that, again, computers we often think of as these disembodied, it's in the cloud. Think about all the language that we have about games. It's never about the actual users or the actual bodies that have created them. And so one of the things that I like thinking about is thinking about, like, where are the bodies in all of these things? And this reminds me of scholar artist Jara Moshe and I curated a week on queering code for the Critical Code Studies Working Group, and we think about these ideas, right? So they argue, I posit that since we live in this heteronormative and homonormative world, there is a need to break these systems open, to write anew, to queer the code. I imagine that queer code, just like queer bodies, is functional within its spaces. As a queer body is always in space-time, so too is the code. It is written and executed in functional spaces. Sometimes queerness and code needs to be hidden. Sometimes it's outright subversive and deviant. And I think body's also space too, right? I mean, I don't know about how the librarians feel about this, but like I always, I've been here since 2005, so I've watched First Floor Suslo change like over the decades now, right? And the move towards like open spaces, or the move towards pods, or the move towards, sort of repurposing what was once stacks, because that was our understanding of the way libraries should work is this, like, how do we change it, right? But at the same time, does this openness create different norms or create different problems? Like, one of the things I said was, can I dim the lights in here? And the answer is no, because these lights were built to just light the floor, right? And that's a problem, because if we're saying these are different spaces, they should be treated as different spaces. Okay. So what am I doing now? My newer work is what I'm calling queer chaos. I'm just making this up, literally. This is what academics do. No. We think about queerness as as disruption, as challenging norms, as breaking binaries, as going back to, queer in the activist days of 1980s, 1990s, like, queer activism around HIV AIDS. It is this sort of in your face kind of mentality, aesthetic, politic, whatever. And so queer gaming for me, I'm trying to think of moving past just like, oh, let's think about glitches, or let's think about changing a mechanic. But like, is there even a further point? And for me, that's chaos. And that chaos in this sense is not, just the conflagration and destruction of everything, but rather what emerges from seemingly unrelated or chaotic things. So queer chaos is queer excess, exuberance. It further reimagines, even unravels the fantasy of technonormative power, control, immersion, interactivity, and intelligibility. Queer chaos is queer challenge, queer change. It's disruptive, even eruptive. It reconfigures our relationships to desire, to identity, to performance, and to play itself. Here I draw on Jay Halbersam's notion of gaga feminism, which is characterized by excess, ecstatic embrace of loss of control, and a maverick sense of a bodily identity. And then queer chaos is queer mending, healing, queer repair, right? Centering non-normative identities and experiences and temporalities, and how that might spill out into everything that we do. A lot of times I get asked a question, I'm sure this is bubbling somewhere in people's minds, like, well, how do we actually do this? How do we actually produce this? How do we actually create this? And my answer is, I don't know, right? Like, and then my version would be different than someone else's version. But like I said before, we can't have it unless we try to imagine it. And so right now, even if we don't have the best queer game or the best queer AI or the best queer chaos, we at least have to think about it and think about what it does. Okay, and there are a lot of games that are sort of playing with these ideas of just like, some people would just call them art games or nonsense games or just doing weird things. And so Robert Yang's game Succulent is at the bottom. And people are like, is it a game? I was like, all you're doing is eating a popsicle. But when you're eating the popsicle, it makes all the figures kind of dance and do weird things. If you've never played it, go for it. It's amazing. It's hilarious and strange. And why does stuff have to actually make sense all over the time? I'm not saying that everything has to be kooky, but I just think, sometimes we have to push the boundaries a little bit. So, the end, coda. So remember, did someone say hope? Again, I'm trying to think about that as well. So, queer chaos might be queer hope. I close with something that happened during this year's CHSI during our session on generative AI. I decided to play with Adobe's Firefly, which is its sort of image generation tech platform. And I wanted to test the implicit biases of the AI, particularly when it was asked to render groups of people. So the initial prompt was images of people from Ohio, which is where I teach, right? And it came up with a strangely bifurcated set of pictures. So it kind of looked like this, sort of, right? So the top was groups of people that looked like this, and the bottom was like white guys, not in the same positioning, but it's like, that's super strange. Like, what is happening what's the guardrails that's happening to make sure that the images included brown people, right? And then I changed the thing to say, and this was the class, right? And we all were like, this is really gay for some reason. Like, it just feels really gay. And so I did the same prompt and I said less gay, right? Images of people from Ohio, but less gay. And it gave us this picture. It returned a very similar set of images, except for the pictures of the white men got 50% gayer, right? And The inclusion of the American flag only intensified this feeling, homo-nationalism and homonormativity at its best. It has like weirdly 50 Shades vibes, like there's like all this stuff that's happening here. I end with this, not because it's hilarious, it is, but because it points to the chaotic, emergent, and ironically humorous, humane potential of these kinds of technologies. Yes, they do and continue to do a boatload of harm, 100%. But if we can find ways to design, train, and play around with these queer serendipities, then I think the world would be a better and queerer place. Thank you! The end.